The storm brews. It was a rainy Tuesday morning, and the airport was alive with the frantic rhythm of early morning travelers. The clatter of rolling suitcases echoed throughout the terminal, blending with the soft murmur of distant announcements. The storm outside cast the windows in a dull, steely gray, and the fluorescent lights above cast an almost clinical glow to the scene. Gate 32, nestled among a cluster of other busy gates, was the focal point of Jasmine Rivers' world at that moment. Jasmine stood near the gate, her back straight and posture impeccable as she reviewed her final pre-flight checklist on her tablet. She had worked tirelessly for this moment. It hadn't been an easy road to becoming a lead pilot, especially as a black woman in an industry that, despite progress, still leaned heavily toward male dominance and racial homogeneity. But Jasmine's determination and skill had spoken for themselves, earning her the respect of her peers. And today, she was about to take the helm of her first flight as captain. She adjusted the navy blue cap atop her head, the gold stripes of her newly earned rank shimmering in the overhead lights. Her uniform, crisp and tailored, reflected not just her professionalism, but her deep sense of pride. She had made it here not just for herself, but for the generations of young women and people of color who dreamed of breaking barriers in aviation. Jasmine's eyes scanned the terminal around her, taking in the bustling crowd, some rushing to catch connecting flights, others grumbling over delays caused by the ongoing storm. The energy was palpable, and while it should have been a stressful environment, Jasmine remained calm and poised. This was her element. Flying was the one thing that had always made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. As she waited for the final briefing before boarding, she spotted a few of her crew members arriving. Several flight attendants and the co-pilot for the day, a young man named Leo who had flown with her on several occasions before. They exchanged a few words of encouragement, both of them eager to get this flight off the ground. Despite the looming storm clouds and the potential turbulence ahead, this was their job, their passion. They were ready. But the peace of this moment was short-lived. A sharp, high-pitched voice sliced through the ambient noise of the terminal. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. Right now." The voice was unmistakable, full of entitlement, and it carried a tone of irritation that immediately drew Jasmine's attention. She turned to see the source of the commotion. Standing near the check-in counter was a woman in her late 40s, perhaps early 50s, with a perfectly styled blonde bob and a facial expression that seemed perpetually sour. The woman, who Jasmine would later come to recognize as Karen Thompson, was waving her boarding pass around like it was an accusation. "I've been waiting for 20 minutes. Karen continued to raise her voice, clearly upset, though the source of her frustration wasn't clear yet. "I am paying for a service, and this is how I am treated. This is an absolute disgrace." Jasmine's gaze hardened slightly. She could see from where she was standing that Karen wasn't being treated any differently than any other passenger. The check-in attendant, a young woman named Sarah, was doing her best to remain calm and professional, her eyes scanning Karen's boarding pass and offering polite reassurances. But Karen wasn't hearing it. Her sense of entitlement, her unshakable belief that she should be prioritized above all else, was beginning to show its true colors. "Excuse me," Karen barked at Sarah, before snapping her gaze toward Jasmine, who stood a few feet away. "Is there some sort of problem with this flight or with your crew? Are you all incompetent? Is that what's going on here?" Jasmine's jaw tightened. She had dealt with more than her fair share of rude passengers over the years, but something about Karen's tone made Jasmine's stomach churn. It wasn't just the complaining. It was the venom in her words, the immediate assumption that everyone around her was beneath her. But Jasmine stayed calm. She had learned long ago to pick her battles. She didn't need to engage with every rude person who crossed her path. Her priority was to ensure that this flight went smoothly. But it didn't end there. Karen, now having turned her full attention toward Jasmine, took a step closer, looking her up and down with visible distaste. "Are you the one in charge here?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "I assume you're the captain. she said with a sneer. Jasmine's grip on her tablet tightened, but she gave a polite nod. Yes, ma'am. I'm the captain for this flight, she said, her voice steady and calm. Karen's eyes narrowed as she gave Jasmine another up-and-down glance. Well, I don't know how you managed to get this position, but I certainly don't trust people like you to be flying my plane, she said, her words coming out slowly and deliberately, as if she were speaking to someone who had no right to be in her presence. The words hit Jasmine like a physical blow. In an instant, the entire terminal seemed to disappear as her focus honed in on Karen's words. But Jasmine wasn't one to react impulsively. She knew that no good could come from responding to this kind of provocation. Instead, she forced a smile, her professionalism overcoming the shock that briefly ran through her. Ma'am, I assure you that I'm fully qualified to fly this aircraft, and I've been through rigorous training to ensure your safety and the safety of all our passengers, Jasmine said, her voice steady, though she could feel a cold fury simmering beneath the surface. Karen wasn't finished, however. She raised her voice once more, now directed at both Sarah and Jasmine. I can't believe this. I'm paying good money for a flight, and I have to be in the same space as this person. She spat the last word as though it was a curse, her face contorting with disgust. The crowd around them began to notice the altercation, with some passengers glancing over, some shaking their heads, and others pulling out their phones, eager to capture the drama unfolding in front of them. It was like a train wreck no one could look away from. Jasmine's heart raced as she held her ground. She had to be strong in this moment. She could feel the weight of every onlooker's gaze. But then, without warning, Karen's hand shot out, striking Jasmine across the face. The slap was sharp, sudden, and the sound of it rang out through the terminal like a gunshot. Jasmine staggered back slightly, taken aback by the unprovoked assault. She didn't even have time to process what had happened before Karen shrieked, "You're not fit to be a pilot." The crowd gasped. Some passengers immediately began shouting at Karen, telling her that her behavior was unacceptable. Others rushed to Jasmine's side, checking to see if she was okay. But Jasmine, still reeling from the shock of the hit, remained calm. She placed a steady hand on her cheek, the sting of the slap a sharp reminder of the prejudices she had fought her entire career to overcome. But instead of lashing out, Jasmine took a deep breath, looking up to the skies above, as if drawing strength from somewhere far beyond this moment. 20 minutes later, you won't believe what happens next, she whispered to herself, a sense of resolve settling over her like the calm before the storm. Jasmine knew that the next steps in this journey wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. The fight was far from over. The aftershock. The slap that had rung out in the bustling airport terminal had left an eerie silence in its wake. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, everything seemed to slow down. Jasmine stood frozen, her fingers pressed gently to her cheek where the impact had left an angry red mark. The sting from the slap was sharp and stinging, but it wasn't the physical pain that rattled her. It was the sheer audacity of what had just happened. The woman had hit her, in front of a crowd, without provocation. As the murmur of shocked passengers filled the air, Jasmine's mind raced. The fiery anger she had expected to feel was strangely absent, replaced by a deep sense of disbelief. She had dealt with prejudice before, of course. Every black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry had. But this was an assault. This was no longer just a casual insult or a rude comment. This was physical violence, and it was directed at her simply because of the color of her skin. A few passengers, their faces marked with outrage, began shouting at Karen. "You can't just hit someone." One man yelled, stepping forward, "What's wrong with you?" Another woman, a middle-aged Latina, clutched her phone and pointed it at Karen, recording the scene. But Jasmine, despite the heat building in her chest, remained still. Her breathing was slow and measured, the calm before a storm that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She could feel the eyes of the entire terminal on her, waiting for her to react, waiting to see what would happen next. As the crowd murmured, some people stepping forward to separate the two women, Jasmine took a deep breath, her gaze focused on Karen. The woman's face was flushed with embarrassment, but there was still a smugness about her posture, as though she didn't believe there would be any real consequences for her actions. Sarah, the check-in attendant, hurried over to Jasmine's side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Jasmine nodded but didn't speak immediately. Instead, she glanced at the growing crowd, who were all watching her closely. She could feel the weight of their collective expectation. She had to be the one to break the tension. She had to show that this wouldn't break her. "Get security," Jasmine said quietly, but with the steel edge of someone who had no intention of letting this go. She could feel her heart racing, but it wasn't fear. No, it was determination. There was no turning back now. "Are you sure?" Sarah hesitated. "We don't want to escalate things." Jasmine's eyes hardened. If she can escalate this to violence, then I'm sure as hell not backing down. Just as Sarah turned to speak with an airport security officer, the murmur of voices intensified. Some of the onlookers were still recording, their cameras capturing the unfolding drama. Others had begun to gather around Karen, who was trying to collect herself, still wearing the expression of someone who couldn't fathom why the world didn't revolve around her. Jasmine's co-pilot, Leo, arrived at the scene just as security began to approach. "What the hell happened?" he asked, his voice filled with concern and disbelief. Jasmine's hand moved to her cheek instinctively, the sting still fresh. "She hit me," she said simply, her voice betraying no hint of the anger she felt. "Unprovoked. Right after calling me. Something I won't repeat." Leo's eyes widened. He knew Jasmine well, knew how poised she was, how she could handle any situation with grace. But this was different. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was an attack. Before anyone could say another word, two security officers arrived at the scene, flanking Karen with an air of authority. The taller of the two, a muscular man in his late 30s, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us," he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen turned to face the officer, a look of indignation crossing her features. "Excuse me? Are you arresting me? Do you have any idea who I am?" She spat the words, as though her social standing should grant her immunity from the consequences of her actions. Jasmine, sensing that Karen was about to escalate things further, stepped forward. "I don't care who you are, or who you think you are. You just assaulted me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. "You have to face the consequences of that." Karen's eyes flared with outrage, but she didn't respond. She could see from the expressions on the faces around her that the crowd was no longer on her side. The earlier whispers of sympathy for her complaint had evaporated, replaced with murmurs of disapproval and even anger. As the security officers led Karen away, the terminal slowly returned to its usual buzz of activity. People went back to their phones and their conversations, though the ripple effects of the incident lingered in the air. But for Jasmine, the moment wasn't over. It was only just beginning. A short while later, Jasmine was seated in the small office off to the side of the gate area, trying to regain her composure. She had been separated from the scene for a few moments, while airport officials spoke with the officers who had escorted Karen away. It wasn't the first time she'd had to handle an unpleasant situation, but it felt different this time. The sheer weight of the assault, combined with the racial slur Karen had thrown at her, had shaken something deep inside Jasmine. She looked at herself in the small mirror of the office, forcing herself to breathe. There was a knot in her chest that she needed to release, but she knew that if she didn't regain control of her emotions, everything she had worked for would be called into question. The door to the office creaked open, and Sarah stepped in, followed by a well-dressed man in his early 40s, who introduced himself as the head of airport security. "Captain Rivers, I'm so sorry for what happened," he began, his tone apologetic but professional. "We're reviewing the footage from the security cameras, and I assure you that Karen Thompson will be banned from this airport for life. We're pressing charges for assault as well." Jasmine nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her at the sound of those words. At least there would be consequences. At least this wouldn't go unpunished. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice steady now. "But it's not just about her. It's about what her actions represent. People like her think they can get away with anything, just because of the color of my skin." The security manager nodded solemnly. "I understand, Captain. We're going to do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen again." Jasmine sighed deeply, then stood up. "Thank you. But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about standing up for what's right, for making sure no one else has to go through what I just did." She paused, the weight of the moment sinking in. This is bigger than a flight or an airport. It's bigger than any one person. As she left the office, Sarah walked with her. "Jasmine, she began, but Jasmine stopped her with a gentle shake of the head. "It's okay. I'll be fine," she said. "This is just one moment in a bigger story, and I'm not going to let it define me." But as she walked back toward the gate, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the terminal on her. She had just been tested, in ways she hadn't expected. And though the storm outside raged on, inside, Jasmine was more determined than ever to rise above it all. 20 minutes later, the boarding call rang out. Jasmine took her place at the front of the line, her gaze steely with resolve. No matter what had happened in the past, or what would happen next, she was ready. This was just another challenge, one she would meet with everything she had. She was the captain now, and nothing could take that away. The unexpected shift. The storm outside had intensified, its howling winds making the terminal feel even more claustrophobic. Rain lashed against the large windows, a heavy downpour that seemed to mirror the chaotic feelings swirling inside Jasmine. She had stepped away from the confrontation with Karen, but the weight of what had transpired continued to hang over her like a dark cloud. As she stood at the gate, overseeing the final boarding process for the flight, her thoughts drifted. Despite her calm demeanor, she couldn't stop replaying the scene over and over in her mind. The sting of the slap, the venom in Karen's voice, the way she had been so unapologetically cruel. Jasmine had spent her life fighting for respect, but in that moment, it felt like the walls had come crashing down. The power dynamic that had been so carefully constructed in her mind, the one that told her if she worked hard enough and proved herself enough, she'd be immune to this kind of treatment, had crumbled. It wasn't enough. She wasn't immune. But the passengers were beginning to board, and Jasmine knew she had a job to do. She had a plane to fly, people to take care of. As much as she wanted to retreat into herself for a moment and process everything that had just happened, there was no time for that. There was only the flight. Her co-pilot, Leo, came up beside her, his face clouded with concern. He had seen the tension in the terminal, and he'd witnessed how Jasmine had handled the situation with admirable grace. But he also knew that she had her limits. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice soft enough that only she could hear. Jasmine glanced at him, offering a tight smile. "I'm fine. Let's just get this plane in the air." Leo hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew better than to press her too much, but he couldn't help feeling that something had shifted in Jasmine. She had always been so composed, so unshakable. But now, there was an edge to her, a quiet intensity that hinted at something deeper, something unresolved. He simply nodded and walked toward the cockpit to finish his pre-flight checks, leaving Jasmine to her thoughts. As she entered the aircraft, the familiar smell of polished leather and metal greeted her, a sense of normalcy in an otherwise turbulent day. She took her place in the cockpit, settling into her seat as the rest of the crew prepared for takeoff. The rumble of the engines starting, the steady hum of the avionics, all of it seemed to ground her in a way nothing else could. But as they began the taxi to the runway, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the air. The incident with Karen, while seemingly resolved, had triggered something deeper inside her. It wasn't just about the slap or the racial slurs. It was about something larger, an ongoing struggle, one she had been fighting for years, but now was impossible to ignore. Her fingers gripped the yoke with newfound determination. This was more than just a job to her. This was a statement. The flight, however, was anything but ordinary. As the plane climbed above the storm clouds, Jasmine's mind wandered back to the terminal. She could still feel the weight of Karen's words echoing in her mind. "You're not fit to be a pilot." The venom in those words, the assumption that she was somehow less than, had cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced in her career. For a split second, she had wondered if Karen might be right, that maybe she wasn't worthy of the position she had fought so hard to earn. But then, she remembered why she was here. She remembered the long hours, the sacrifice, the hurdles she had cleared just to get to this place. Jasmine had never been given anything. She had earned every inch of the respect she had gained. She knew her worth. As she looked over at Leo, who was seated beside her and checking instruments, she realized that in this moment, in this cockpit, she had control. The outside world might throw challenges her way, but here, she could rise above it all. Here, she was untouchable. The flight continued uneventfully for the next hour as they cruised at 35,000 feet, the storm clouds now far beneath them. Jasmine felt a sense of calm wash over her, the familiar routine of flying offering a sense of relief. The passengers, for the most part, seemed relaxed, some even sleeping through the turbulence that had rattled their initial climb. But then, an unexpected notification flashed on the dashboard. A potential technical malfunction in the aircraft's left engine. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, but her years of training kicked in. She had dealt with potential malfunctions before, but the reality of handling one mid-flight was different. There was no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. Every second counted. "Leo," Jasmine said, her voice steady but firm. "We've got a potential issue with the left engine. Let's do a systems check and notify air traffic control." Leo's hands flew over the controls, his eyes flicking back and forth between the readings on the dashboard. His face, usually calm and collected, now showed a hint of urgency. "I've got the readings. It's definitely something we need to address. Let's get to work." For the next 10 minutes, the cockpit was filled with the rapid clicking of buttons and the low hum of communication between the crew and air traffic control. Jasmine's mind was laser-focused, blocking out everything except the immediate task at hand. It was moments like this that made her feel alive. The weight of the responsibility, the need for quick decision-making, the necessity to keep everyone safe. Meanwhile, the passengers remained unaware of the tension unfolding in the cockpit. The flight attendants went about their duties, offering drinks, making small talk, doing their best to keep the atmosphere light. But Jasmine and Leo knew that the situation was critical, and time was of the essence. At that moment, Jasmine understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Adversity wasn't something you could escape. It wasn't something you could choose when and where it would appear. But how you responded, that was everything. The aircraft was now hundreds of miles away from the airport, and while air traffic control had cleared them to continue on their route, Jasmine wasn't about to take any chances. They had been flying in a holding pattern, waiting for a final confirmation from the ground crew on whether the issue had been fully resolved or if they'd need to make an emergency landing. Leo was still monitoring the systems, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jasmine's fingers danced over the console, double-checking everything. She had trained for moments like this, emergencies, challenges, the unexpected. It was what she had signed up for, after all. But even with all the training in the world, there was always an element of the unknown. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Leo looked up at Jasmine and nodded. "We're in the clear. The engine's running smoothly now. We can resume normal operations." Jasmine exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Good," she said, her voice quieter now. She allowed herself a brief moment of relief before shifting her focus back to the task at hand. They had made it through. The plane, the passengers, and her. Everyone was safe. But something had changed in Jasmine during this flight. The moment with Karen, while painful and unjust, had triggered something inside her. It had reminded her of why she was doing this. It wasn't just about flying planes. It was about proving that women like her, black women, women of color, had every right to take the cockpit, to lead, to command. She wasn't going to let anyone, least of all a racist, knock her down. And with that, she refocused on the horizon, her gaze steady as the plane continued its journey through the sky. The storm, both outside and within, had passed. For now, anyway. Hours later, as they began their descent toward their destination airport, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what she had just overcome. Despite the challenges, despite the ugly moments of the day, she had done her job. She had stayed strong, and she had kept control. And that was what truly mattered. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Jasmine allowed herself a brief smile. The storm had passed, but this was far from the end of the journey. It was only the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The ripple effect. As the wheels of the aircraft touched down on the runway with a smooth thud, the familiar hum of the engines began to fade. Jasmine sat back in her seat, exhaling deeply as the plane glided toward the gate. Despite the harrowing events of the flight, she felt a deep sense of relief. The turbulence, both in the sky and in her heart, had finally subsided. But what had happened earlier that day, the altercation with Karen, lingered in her mind. She had handled it with professionalism, as she always did, but the emotional weight of it was something she knew would take time to process. She wasn't sure yet how it would affect her, but she knew one thing for certain. The confrontation was far from over. As the plane came to a stop, and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Jasmine leaned back in her seat, her fingers tracing the outline of the cockpit's control panel. She had always felt at home here, surrounded by the hum of electronics and the smooth, controlled movements of the aircraft. But today, it felt different. Today, the cockpit was both her sanctuary and her battleground. "Captain Rivers, you did a great job up there," Leo said, his voice breaking through her thoughts as he unclipped his seatbelt and began gathering his things. "I know that wasn't easy." Jasmine gave him a small, tired smile. "Thanks, Leo. It was a lot. But we made it. We always make it." Leo paused, his eyes catching hers. "Yeah, we do. And you're right. But you know, you didn't just make it through the flight. You made it through everything. What happened at the gate, that wasn't just an isolated incident. People like Karen. They think they can do whatever they want because they think no one will fight back. You fought back, Jasmine. You didn't just survive. You won." His words hung in the air for a moment, and Jasmine felt a tightness in her chest. She had fought back, yes, but it hadn't been about winning. It hadn't even been about Karen. It had been about proving to herself that she was strong enough to handle whatever came her way, no matter how ugly, no matter how unjust. "Thanks," Jasmine replied softly, turning away from Leo as she stood up to begin unstrapping her gear. Her mind wandered again, reflecting on the events that had unfolded, and on the question that now sat heavily on her heart. What would happen next? Later that evening, after the flight crew had completed their debriefing and the passengers had disembarked, Jasmine found herself sitting alone in her hotel room, her eyes fixed on the window. The city outside was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, its skyline framed by the soft purple hues of twilight. It was peaceful here, but within her, there was still a storm brewing. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, breaking the stillness. It was a message from her older brother, Marcus. "Hey, sis, I saw what happened today. You okay?" Jasmine stared at the message for a few moments, her thumb hovering over the screen. How could she even begin to explain what had happened? How could she put into words the feeling of being slapped in front of a crowd, of hearing words she'd heard before, but never from someone so brazen, so overt in their hatred? But as she typed out her response, she realized something. The emotional weight of the day wasn't going to disappear. It wasn't something she could simply brush off. She had to confront it, had to find a way to channel it into something bigger than herself. "I'm okay. I'll be fine. Just trying to process it all, you know." She paused before hitting send, then added, "But I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how we let people like Karen get away with it. It's not just about me anymore. It's about all of us, people who have to fight every day to prove we belong." She hit send and sat back, letting the weight of her own words sink in. Jasmine had always prided herself on being resilient, on handling adversity with poise and grace. But what had happened with Karen felt different. It wasn't just one woman's ignorance. It was a reflection of a larger problem, one that stretched across society. The fight wasn't just personal. It was collective. The phone buzzed again. Marcus had responded. "You've always been strong, sis. Don't let people like that define you. But don't let them keep winning, either. The world needs people like you to speak up. Don't let them silence you." Jasmine smiled to herself, grateful for Marcus's support. He was right. She had always fought for what she believed in. But now, the stakes felt higher. She had to do something with this anger, this frustration. If she didn't, it would fester inside her and poison everything she had worked for. The next morning, Jasmine woke up early, the weight of the previous day still hanging over her. She had slept poorly, her dreams haunted by images of Karen's face and the sound of her slap echoing through her mind. But now, as the soft light of dawn filtered through the blinds, Jasmine felt a shift inside her. She had faced adversity before, but today she felt like something had been awakened in her, a new kind of resolve. She grabbed her phone and opened her social media feed, scrolling through the messages that had poured in overnight. There were dozens of people, friends, colleagues, and even strangers, who had reached out to her after the incident at the airport. Some offered words of support, others simply expressed their disbelief over what had happened. One message stood out in particular. It was from a fellow pilot, Sarah Matthews, who had been following Jasmine's career from afar. She had a large following of her own on social media and had recently started advocating for women and people of color in aviation. "Jasmine, I saw what happened yesterday, and I just want to say how incredibly proud I am of you. You stood your ground, and that's something we all need to see more of in this industry. I know what it's like to be overlooked, to be dismissed, but I also know that you are a trailblazer. Your courage is inspiring, and I'm with you in this fight. Let's make sure it's not in vain." Jasmine stared at the message for a long time, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. The moment with Karen wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a catalyst. It was time to use her voice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been marginalized, overlooked, or oppressed. For too long, she had played the game by others' rules, keeping her head down and pushing through the challenges in silence. But the world was changing, and Jasmine was going to be part of that change. She stood up from the bed, her heart pounding with newfound purpose. It was time to take action. That afternoon, Jasmine took to social media herself, posting a powerful message that she knew would resonate far beyond her immediate circle. She shared a photo of herself in her pilot's uniform, standing tall and proud in front of the aircraft, her gaze confident and unyielding. "Yesterday, I was slapped in an airport terminal by a woman who didn't believe I belonged in the cockpit. It wasn't the first time I faced discrimination, and it probably won't be the last. But I'll tell you this, I will not be silenced. I will not let people like her define my worth. I am a pilot, and I belong here." The post went viral within hours, shared by hundreds of people, many of them women of color and others who had experienced similar discrimination in their own lives. Messages of support poured in from all corners of the globe, and Jasmine realized that she had just ignited something bigger than herself, a movement. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins. The ripple effect had begun. As the days passed, Jasmine continued to use her platform to speak out against discrimination in aviation and beyond. She was invited to speak at conferences, to participate in interviews, and even to collaborate with other advocates who were working to bring change to industries just as entrenched in inequality as aviation. Jasmine had always known that her journey would be filled with challenges, but she never imagined how one moment of injustice would lead to this. She had started the day as a woman fighting for respect. By the end of the week, she was leading a movement. And she wasn't stopping. The world had finally started to listen, and Jasmine was ready to make them hear her roar. Rising above. The weeks that followed Jasmine's viral social media post were nothing short of transformative. The ripple effect she had sparked wasn't just a fleeting moment. It became a full-fledged movement. What began as a response to a personal attack had evolved into a platform for change. Jasmine had unintentionally become the face of a growing call for equity and justice in the aviation industry, but it was quickly becoming clear her fight was not just hers anymore. It was the fight of countless others who had been marginalized, dismissed, or silenced. Jasmine's phone never stopped buzzing. Messages of support, advice, invitations to speak at conferences, and media requests flooded in daily. She was contacted by organizations that advocated for racial and gender equality, offering her opportunities to lead initiatives, participate in panel discussions, and even mentor young women of color who aspired to careers in aviation. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. Jasmine had always been the quiet achiever, someone who preferred to let her work speak for itself. But now she was being thrust into the spotlight, and with it came a responsibility she hadn't anticipated. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want to be seen as someone capitalizing on her experience. She hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't planned on becoming the poster child for change. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't about her anymore. This was about all the people who felt unseen, unheard, and unworthy. This was about giving them a voice, using her platform not just to speak her truth, but to amplify theirs. Jasmine knew that her journey had reached a turning point, and it was time to make it count. One of the first calls Jasmine received after her post went viral came from an unexpected source: Karen Thompson. It had been days since the incident at the airport, and Jasmine had almost forgotten about the woman who had slapped her. She had moved on, or at least tried to. But as the phone rang and Jasmine saw the name flash on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. Karen Thompson. She hesitated before answering. "Hello," Jasmine said, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "Jasmine." The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. "It's Karen. I wanted to talk." Jasmine felt a surge of emotion but kept her composure. "Why? You've already said everything that needed to be said." "I know, and I deeply regret what happened. I don't know what came over me. I was having a bad day, and Jasmine cut her off. "No, Karen. You don't get to make excuses for your behavior. What you did wasn't about a bad day. It was about you thinking you had the right to belittle me, to put me in my place because of who I am. That's not something you can apologize for in a single phone call." There was a long pause. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken, the anger from that day bubbling up again. She took a deep breath before continuing, her voice firm but controlled. "I don't need your apology. What I need is for people like you to wake up and realize that your actions have consequences. You can't go around treating people like they're beneath you. You can't keep acting like the world belongs to you, and people like me have to beg for a place in it. Do you understand that?" Karen's voice trembled on the other end. I understand. I can't undo what I did, Jasmine, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. And I'm going to do better. I want to learn. I want to make things right. If I can." Jasmine took a moment to absorb the words. It wasn't an easy conversation. The hurt she had felt, the trauma of that moment, was still fresh in her mind. But something had shifted. Karen had owned her mistake in a way that felt sincere. Jasmine could hear the regret in her voice, the recognition that her behavior had been wrong. I appreciate you saying that, Jasmine said, her voice softening slightly. But words are just that, words. It's your actions from here on out that will show whether or not you've truly learned something. You can start by checking your privilege and using your platform for good. Educate others who think like you. I will, Karen replied. I promise. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help you with the cause you're fighting for. Jasmine paused, considering the offer. She could feel the weight of her decision. Was she ready to forgive? Was she willing to turn this negative into something positive, even if it meant working with the person who had wronged her? After a long pause, Jasmine finally said, I don't know if I'm ready to work with you yet, Karen, but I'll think about it, and I'll be watching. They ended the call shortly after, and Jasmine sat still for a long while, reflecting on what had just happened. She had made it clear that she wasn't interested in easy apologies or empty gestures, but she also understood that true growth sometimes came from unlikely places. Only time would tell if Karen's apology was genuine, or if it was just an attempt to save face. For now, Jasmine focused on what she could control, the work ahead of her. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Jasmine took on speaking engagements, panel discussions, and interviews. Everywhere she went, she was met with the same question. What's next? She had started the conversation, but now she was part of something much larger, a movement that was gaining momentum across the aviation industry and beyond. She was invited to speak at an international conference on gender and racial equality in the workplace, where she would share her story and discuss how systemic barriers affected women of color in industries like aviation, technology, and beyond. Her message was clear. Discrimination wasn't just a personal affront. It was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed from the top down. Jasmine spoke about the struggles she faced as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. She talked about how every day was a battle to prove her worth, to fight against stereotypes, and to break down barriers that had been in place for decades. But her message wasn't just about the problems. It was about the solutions. She advocated for policies that promoted diversity and inclusion, calling on corporations and institutions to do more than just pay lip service to equality. She encouraged businesses to invest in mentorship programs for women and minorities, to offer better training on unconscious bias, and to ensure that hiring practices were fair and equitable. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Jasmine sat alone in her hotel room, scrolling through her phone. She had just received a message from Sarah Matthews, the fellow pilot who had reached out to her after the viral post. I've been following your progress, Jasmine. You're making waves, and I'm so proud of you. I know you're busy, but we need to talk about what comes next. This movement isn't just about us. It's about changing the entire culture of aviation. Jasmine paused for a moment before typing her response. I know, and I'm ready. Let's make this bigger than just one person. It's time we start pushing for real change. It wasn't just about her anymore. The message was spreading far beyond her own experience. The movement had gone global, with pilots, flight attendants, and even passengers speaking out about their own experiences with discrimination. It was no longer just about one woman fighting back. It was about an entire community coming together to demand a seat at the table, to tear down the barriers that had kept them out for so long. Jasmine knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, resistance, and even more moments of adversity. But now she was ready, and she had the support of countless others standing beside her, each of them carrying their own stories, their own burdens, and their own hopes for change. The storm had passed, but the fight was far from over. The power of change. Jasmine Rivers stood at the podium of a packed auditorium, the bright lights of the conference hall casting a soft glow on her navy blue uniform. The crowd was full of industry professionals, pilots, engineers, corporate leaders, and activists, all gathered for the annual Aviation Equality Summit. Jasmine had been invited to speak about her experience as a black woman in aviation and the challenges of breaking through barriers of discrimination. But this wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about something bigger. As she adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath, Jasmine couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. Not just from that fateful day at the airport when Karen slapped her in front of the crowd, but from the quiet, unsure woman she had been before. The woman who would have never imagined that she could be the one to lead a movement. Her voice had once been something she kept to herself, a quiet strength that went unnoticed by the larger world. But now it was louder than ever before. And for the first time, it was being heard. "I'm not here to tell you my story," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You've all heard that. I shared it on social media, I've been in the news, and it's even been covered in documentaries. What I'm here to tell you is this. My story isn't the only one. There are thousands of women, men, and non-binary individuals in this room who have faced the same struggles I have. And there are millions more out there who haven't even been given a chance to speak." Jasmine paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle in the room. The energy was palpable, an awareness spreading through the audience that what she was saying wasn't just a call for personal empowerment, but a rallying cry for change. "I was slapped by a woman who didn't think I belonged in the cockpit. And I won't lie to you, it hurt. But I think what hurt more was realizing that I wasn't the first person she had ever treated like that. There are so many people like me, and you, who have been overlooked, undermined, and excluded because of our gender, our race, our backgrounds. This isn't just about one bad experience at the airport. It's a reflection of the larger issue that we're all complicit in, whether we realize it or not." Jasmine's voice steadied, her hands gripping the edges of the podium as she continued. "For too long, we've accepted discrimination as part of the status quo. We've let it slide because we've been told that things are getting better, or that progress is slow but steady. Well, I'm here to tell you that slow isn't good enough anymore. We can't afford to wait any longer. The system needs to change now." There was a murmur of agreement in the room, a collective nod of recognition that echoed Jasmine's sentiment. She felt the energy shift. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs too. Since the viral post and her subsequent involvement in the movement, Jasmine had been busy behind the scenes. She'd met with executives at major airlines, pushed for policy changes, and collaborated with advocacy groups to create actionable plans for diversity and inclusion. She had helped establish mentorship programs for young women and people of color who aspired to careers in aviation, and she had worked tirelessly to ensure that hiring practices in the industry were more transparent and equitable. But as much as she'd accomplished, Jasmine knew that real change would require a collective effort. It would take more than a handful of passionate voices. It would require every person in the industry, from the top down, to stand up and challenge the norms. She had created a coalition of professionals from all walks of life who shared her vision for a more inclusive future. The group had grown exponentially, drawing attention from powerful figures across industries. What had started as a personal call for respect had become a global movement, one that transcended the aviation world and reached into the broader conversation about equality, access, and representation in every field. "We've started something," Jasmine continued, her voice steady and confident. "But this is just the beginning. We've begun to build a foundation, but it's fragile. Change isn't easy, and it's never quick. The fight ahead won't be simple. But if we're going to make lasting change, we need to look beyond our individual stories and think about the greater good. We need to create a world where people of all races, genders, and backgrounds feel welcome in every space they occupy, whether it's the cockpit, the boardroom, or the classroom." The crowd was silent now, hanging on to every word she said. Jasmine could see the looks of determination on their faces, the way they were nodding in agreement, ready to take action. She knew that what was happening in that room wasn't just a speech. It was the birth of something that could change the industry forever. After the summit, Jasmine was invited to sit down with executives from one of the world's largest airlines. They had been following her journey closely, and they wanted to hear her ideas for creating a more inclusive culture within their organization. Jasmine had spent weeks preparing for this meeting, knowing that the opportunity to influence such a massive corporation could have far-reaching consequences. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for the thousands of people who had been overlooked and pushed aside for far too long. As she walked into this sleek, modern conference room, Jasmine felt a surge of confidence. She wasn't just a woman trying to make a point. She was a leader with a vision for a better, more inclusive future. The meeting began with formalities, but Jasmine didn't waste any time. She got straight to the heart of the matter. "I'm here today because I want to help you change the way you think about diversity," she began. "I want you to understand that it's not just about hiring more women or people of color. It's about creating an environment where those people feel valued, where they can thrive, and where their voices are heard. It's about more than just checking boxes. It's about changing the culture of the entire organization." The executives listened attentively as Jasmine spoke about her experiences in the industry, about the obstacles she had faced as a black woman in a field that was predominantly white and male. She talked about the isolation, the microaggressions, and the systemic barriers that had prevented her from fully realizing her potential. But she didn't just focus on the problems. She offered solutions, real, tangible actions that the company could take to foster a more inclusive environment. "I'm not asking you to make changes overnight," she continued, "but I am asking you to take responsibility. I'm asking you to look at your hiring practices, your leadership pipelines, your mentorship programs. I'm asking you to actively seek out diversity and to create opportunities for people who've been left out for too long. Because if you don't, someone else will, and you'll be left behind." The room was silent for a moment as the executives absorbed her words. Finally, the senior VP of Human Resources spoke up. "Jasmine, we hear you, and we're committed to making changes. We've already started working on some of the things you mentioned, but we need your help. We need someone who's been in the trenches, someone who understands the challenges firsthand. We need you to help us lead this change." Jasmine felt a surge of pride and hope. This was exactly what she had wanted, to turn her pain into something productive, to use her story not just to inspire, but to create real change. She wasn't just a voice in the crowd anymore. She was part of the solution. Over the next few months, Jasmine worked closely with the airline's leadership team, helping them implement new policies that would address issues of diversity and inclusion. She also partnered with other organizations to create industry-wide initiatives aimed at providing scholarships for aspiring pilots of color and women, offering mentorship, and creating more accessible pathways into aviation careers. Jasmine's influence began to spread beyond aviation. Other industries, tech, finance, healthcare, started reaching out to her, eager to implement similar changes within their own organizations. She became a sought-after speaker and consultant, invited to share her expertise on how companies could become more inclusive and how they could address unconscious bias in their hiring practices and corporate cultures. A year later, Jasmine stood on the stage again, this time at a major global conference on leadership and diversity. Her keynote address was highly anticipated, and as she took the stage, she felt the weight of her journey. The world had changed, and she had been part of it. She began by reflecting on where she had started. "Just over a year ago, I was a pilot flying a routine flight, dealing with turbulence in the skies. Little did I know that the real turbulence I was about to face wasn't in the air. It was in the hearts of people around me, people who didn't think I belonged. But that's the thing about turbulence," she said, pausing for effect. "It's never permanent. If you stay focused, if you stay calm, you can ride through it. And when you come out on the other side, you're stronger than before." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jasmine smiled, knowing that her fight hadn't been in vain. The change she had started had taken root, and now it was thriving. And Jasmine knew, without a doubt, that she was just getting started.